Welcome to Terrible Lizards, a podcast about dinosaurs with Dr. David Hone and Izzy Lawrence. On this week's episode, we have Paul Upchurch talking about stampy stamps, necky necks. I'm not allowed to say either of these. It's the sauropods. Hello and welcome to Terrible Lizards. We're going to continue our theme of having guest paleontologists to interview, and I'm really excited because one of my favourite episodes of this was actually Diplodocus, which was our second ever episode, I think, and it was incredible because I found out that they had sparkly, amazing eyes and vision, and they could see in UV light, and that they had the ability to eat tree branches like I eat a Solero by putting the whole thing in my mouth and then pulling because their teeth direction, and I remembered the word for jelly cordata. I really loved the sauropods, Dave, and now we're going to have a whole episode on sauropods. I'm dead excited.
Yes, well, and indeed we're talking to Paul Upchurch, who was one of the people who wrote the original paper on Diplodocus tooth shredding stuff. So yes, it's particularly relevant. Though it's slightly depressing. It's like one of my favourite ever episode was the second one we did. Suggests we peaked rather early and it's been downhill ever since.
I don't know. There's been some good ones since then. I'm sure there must have been one.
You just don't remember them.
Well, I quite like the Asdarchids. That was a good one.
They are good.
They are. Anyway, but we're not talking about Asdarchids, we're talking about sauropods and sauropodomorphs.
Well, no, we don't really talk about sauropodomorphs in this.
I thought the early ones in the Triassic with the little short stumpy.
Yes,
stumpy
but they are not sauropods. That's the thing.
Okay.
So you've got the non-sauropod and sauropodomorphs are the inverted commas pro-sauropods, which are mostly bipedal, and we're only talking about the true sauropods.
Okay, with the all 4 feet on the ground, unless they're fighting in like prehistoric planet with their weird puffy neck things. Yes. So if you like, your sauropods, you're going to love this episode. Like Dave said, we have Paul Upchurch, and here he is talking to us from his office. Very excited because we finally got an expert on who knows stuff about dinosaurs, unlike Dave. We've got Paul Upchurch on. Now, all I know about Paul is I think you're like the head of rocks or geology or something like that at UCL. You're a professor there, but your background is in geology and sauropods and that sort of... Am I right?
Yeah, we prefer Department of Earth Sciences because...
Okay, fair enough. You do glaciers as well?
Well, yes, yeah. Arsenic, groundwater pollution, ice sheet thickness, volcanoes, yeah, the whole lot. So,
do you do mud and the causes of mud?
We probably do mud, but yeah. I try to steer clear of that sort of thing.
It's good money in mud, though. All the farmers like it. Infiltration rates. Woohoo! Sorry, we're getting nerdy stuff. But Dave's invited you on this podcast mainly because you are an expert, as far as I understand, on sauropods, which are the big tall ones with the long necks.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Well, that was the basics of it. We've been going for 7 series. Is this 8 series? Oh, good God. Yeah, we've done that much already. And we tend to focus on things I know quite well because I don't always have time to do the background research. And so I can talk about Diplodocus for 30 or 40 minutes without too much trouble. And I can have a crack at brachiosaurs. And then I start to run into real trouble. And yeah, I mean, like titanosaurs we've mentioned in passing. And that's about as far as we've got. Lots of the weird Chinese stuff, which, okay, I've seen but never really worked on, mamenchisaurs and all of that stuff, which you've worked on heavily, we've never even really looked at for more than, minutes at a time. And so once you kindly/foolishly agreed to come on here, it was like, great, all this stuff that I don't know that well, and I want to know some of what you think about these things is fantastic. So let's start with what I think was one of my favourite ever talks. So Paul and I met again recently at SVPCA's, that's a Symposium for Vertebrate Paleontology and Comparative Anatomy in the UK. And I think it was at Oxford-ish, maybe 10 years ago, where Paul gave a wonderful talk on mamenchisaurs and some of these odd Chinese sauropods that he and another paleontologist, Jeff Wilson, had basically been arguing about the exact relationships of them for many, many years. And you were unfortunately forced to concede at the end of your talk that Jeff was right.
Yeah, well, the story has moved on. So, yeah, where do we start? I mean, sauropods, they were a really successful group. They first evolved probably around around 230 million years ago. They made it right through to the final dinosaur extinction 66 million years ago. They were globally distributed. So, really successful. And there are a lot of them in China, particularly from sort of the middle and late Jurassic. So we're talking about 170 to about 145 million years ago. But it's turned out to be a real taxonomic tangle, if I can put it like that. Some of these things were described 60, 70 years ago, right in the middle of, I guess, political turmoil in China and under Mao Zedong's rule and so on, where I think the priorities probably weren't vertebrate paleontology. And so there's a lot to sort out there. And, Chinese colleagues are starting to get to grips with this. But, we've been fortunate enough as Westerners to be invited to China and have a look at the stuff and sort of try to give a global comparative perspective. But actually, I think I'm going to say that it turns out that both Jeff and I were right with regard to certain issues, and that the story continues. So what was really at the heart of early discussions was essentially a biogeographic issue. So we think that China and perhaps East Asia generally might have been isolated from the rest of the world during the middle and late Jurassic. And when you separate off a bunch of organisms on their own kind of island, then they tend to do their own thing in evolutionary terms. So we thought we had this grouping of mamenchisaurs in China that were kind of a separate group, perhaps convergently, doing some of the things that sauropods are doing elsewhere in the world. And so I was arguing for this separateness, and Jeff was sort of arguing against that. And at the time, some of the animals I put into that assemblage as part of this story probably, do actually belong in other parts of, sauropod evolutionary family tree. So I had to concede that, and that's fine. That's how science works, and I think good scientists should always be able to put their hand up and say, yeah, got that wrong. But actually what is beginning to emerge now is that there is still a bunch of species out there very closely related to things like mamenchisaurs, which are genuinely very closely related to each other and represent some kind of radiation within China. But it looks like some other things are going on as well. So some things from outside of China were clearly able to get in, and we even have one possible mamenchisaur in Tanzania. So they may have got out as well and spread around.
Wow,
so
that's new.
Yeah. So as usual, the story turns out to be more complex than we first realised.
Just for the listeners who don't know what and I'm going to say it wrong, mamenchisaur? Is that right?
Mamenchisaur, yeah.
Mamenchisaur.
Yeah.
What's a mamenchisaur look like are we talking about an early sauropod? Are we talking about a sort of middle? Because I know you said they sort of arrived in the middle Jurassic.
Yeah. So essentially they're, I guess it's all relative, but they're true sauropods. They're fairly advanced animals by sauropod standards. But essentially, they have the typical sauropod body plan. So you've got your small head or long neck, the big barrel-like body for digesting large quantities of plant material. To support that large body, you stand on all four legs, they're quadrupedal, and you've got a longish tail coming out the back. So why are mamenchisaurs different? Well, what they do, oddly, is they are the kings really of super long necks. So we think of long necks as being a sauropod thing. A few of them actually shorten their necks a bit. A lot of the animals we would see around the world through sauropod history we describe as sort of having medium length necks, so perhaps about 30% of total body length, that sort of thing. But the mamenchisaurs go crazy. They instead of having 12, 13, 15 neck vertebrae, they push it up to 18 or 19.
Whoa.
They elongate individual neck vertebrae quite a lot, and they can end up with a neck that is virtually half of their body length. I mean, it's kind of crazy. And they had to do all sorts of things to make this possible. If you cut the bones open or CT scan them, you can see they've got this really sort of honeycomb arrangement of bone and air inside, so they're relatively light for their weight. It raises questions about what were they doing with these super long necks? Were they just using them to sweep their heads around to pick up vegetation from close to the ground, or were they the supreme champions of reaching up high into the trees to gather vegetation?
And
Would you want to know the answer to that?
Yes, can you send a film camera back so we can see?
Yeah, so there have been some biomechanical studies done by some German colleagues in particular, and it varies a little bit, but it actually looks like, oddly for me anyway, that these may have been low to medium level browsers. So it looks like it would have been typical for a mamenchisaur to kind of have its neck around about 20 to 30 degrees above the horizontal. And I did a few calculations, and we're looking at sort of browse heights. So this is where you can get your head comfortably. browse heights of around between 1 meter above ground level and about 6 meters above ground level, which is still, the kind of level that a giraffe could get to. But we're not envisioning the neck shooting straight up in some vertical position, because some of these necks in absolute terms are enormous. We're talking a neck of 14, 15 meters. So having that going straight up creates all sorts of problems for getting the blood up to the brain.
Dizziness. I get dizzy spells.
Or actually fainting, which if you weigh 30 tons is a serious issue.
Yes, particularly if you've got a very small skull that's presumably not very dense.
Yeah, and also lots of predators around thinking, oh, that one's fainted. That's going to be an easy kill. So you've got to stay alert, I think.
Yeah, it's probably not a strategic advantage to just randomly pass out as a herbivore.
No, exactly.
They're very prevalent in China and also Tanzania.
Well, we found one. I mean, this is the thing about the fossil record, right? I mean, China has these fantastic, nearly complete skeletons with skulls. And of course, you can get that with sauropods elsewhere in the world. But we also deal with a lot of fragments. So the one in Tanzania basically it's not a bad specimen. It's about 30 tail vertebrae in a row. So there's quite a lot of information there. And in our sort of evolutionary tree analyses, it's coming out as a mamenchisaur, which is kind of intriguing. We might possibly have one in the UK as well. Ooh. So there's a historically interesting species discovered in the late 19th century called Cetiosauriscus.
I was about to say, is that going to be Cetiosauriscus? Because I know that's a weird tail. Wow. I as a slight aside, so I just got my classic Natural History Museum Invicta dinosaur toy, Cetiosaurus, the other day. I've got it on eBay, which of course was renamed Cetiosauriscus. So wow, if that's a mamenchisaur, that'd be extremely cool.
Let me interrupt you there, Dave. So actually, Cetiosaurus and Cetiosauriscus are two separate things, and there has been a huge confusion between them.
Oh, I thought it had been renamed.
Yeah, it's a huge taxonomic tangle, which I had the great pleasure, in quotes, of disentangling about 20 years ago, but it still goes on. So you've got Cetiosaurus, which is a Middle Jurassic English sauropod from places like Oxfordshire, and that is somewhere where we'd expect it to be as a Middle Jurassic sauropod. It's kind of possibly most closely related to a few things from South America, interestingly. But then we've got Cetiosauriscus, which is slightly younger by, about 5-10 million years, that sort of thing. And that's from Cambridgeshire, around Peterborough, some of the clay brick pits around there. And that, for a long time, was thought to be closely related to things like Diplodocus. But now there is a distinct possibility that it's going to fit into this mamenchisaur grouping. To be fair to you, Dave, you would have to have quite a lot of specialist knowledge to look at the two of them and tell them apart. So it's not bad to get them confused.
So we had Joe Bonser on a couple of weeks ago and, talking about the iguanodontian tangle. And, I assume it's very much part of that same problem of British researchers in the late 1800s, early 1900s. You don't have that framework of complete specimens from America. You don't have a modern evolutionary understanding, and you're working from bits. And everything goes into one of two distinct possibilities. Either they name absolutely everything and you have 30 new names based on 30 random bones, or they assume absolutely any bit is the same as that species they named 20 years ago, and now 20 different species have been lumped under one.
Yeah, I absolutely love those guys. I mean, I kind of hated them at first because because my PhD project was basically to try to build the first evolutionary tree for sauropods, but also to resolve what was going on in the UK. And we had about 50 named species in Britain, and I've reduced that down to a handful. And Cetiosaurus itself had about 12, 13 species, which I reduced down to one. I might have been slightly too severe there. There might be two, but it's that order of magnitude. But yeah, they're great. You'd read these papers in sort of the quarterly journal of the Geological Society from 1880 something, and it would be, well, we found this bone here, and then we found this other bone, not even the same bone. So we found a vertebra here, and we found a tooth 3 miles away, probably the same thing. So it's like, great, thanks for that. That's really helpful. So you sort of disentangle that sort of thing. But actually, although it was a bit of a headache doing that, I've grown to have a slightly perverse pleasure in the kind of detective work that goes on to sort that out. And I remember I wrote a paper in 2015 sorting out basically just like, forelimb, so the humerus, ulnar, and radius from the animal. That's all we had basically, and a bit of interesting skin impression. I'm trying to sort out what this thing was, and it had been named by Gideon Mantell in 1852, and actually it's the first recorded specimen of skin impression from a dinosaur anywhere. So that's kind of interesting. Nice. And I had to go through all these papers where people had discussed this and said what it was. And, there are all sorts of little wrinkles. Sometimes people would cause confusion because they transposed a couple of the specimen numbers, and this would sort of, send somebody off on a wild trajectory that if only they got the specimen number right, wouldn't have happened. So it's very, very obscure, very arcane, but I kind of get a perverse pleasure in disentangling this stuff and simplifying it. That's just me. I'm obviously weird.
I mean, I have got a drawer full of wires and headphone cables and things, so if you ever want to sort those through for me, you'd be very welcome.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's my skill set, really. If I can take the drawer away with me and have it on the train so that during my hour's commute, this is what I used to do. I'd read these Victorian papers during my hour's commute and make gradual progress with them. So if I could do that, then maybe I can do something for you.
Talk us through a little bit, because I know very little about the general rules of sauropod evolution. Is it a case that they just get bigger over time? Because they start off with very long necks, and I'd have expected the necks to start short and then get longer over time. What's the general rules for them as a sort of group?
We know a lot more about this than we used to 10, 20 years ago. I mean, essentially, we now have some nice, what you might call intermediate sauropods, very early things from the late Triassic, so things that are around 210 million years ago, a group called the Lesomsaurids, mainly from South America and South Africa. And they increase their body size. They have a tendency to be much more quadrupedal. They show some elongation of the neck. There are quite a few things in the skull which we would describe as open quotes primitive. So they've got some work to do in terms of updating their plant-eating technology in that sense. But it gives us a fairly good idea of how things got started for the sauropods. And then essentially we do see a general trend from then during the Jurassic of increasing body size. We did a paper on this with Roger Benson and other people in 2014 looking at body size evolution in dinosaurs. And you can see sauropods sort of expanding to fill what we might call ecospace or morphospace in terms of body size. But then they kind of hit stasis, I guess, because there are some limits on how big you can get before bones start to break and this kind of thing. But potentially those limits themselves, you can evolve around them. So if you find a new technology, as it were, a new way of making your bones lighter but keeping them strong, then perhaps you can then push into the next level up in terms of body size. So we see this increase in body size in the Jurassic period to about 140 million years ago. And in terms of neck length, again, we actually do see, I think what was going on is that sauropods, once they got going, were probably specializing for relatively high level browsing. So they're getting resources from the tops of trees, and they're using their large bodies and long necks to access that. And of course, that's great for them because it keeps them above competition with all the other herbivorous dinosaurs and other things that are wandering around with heads a couple of meters above ground level. So it's got like free food, as it were, in that sense. And the only other competitors they had to worry about were other sauropods. But in the late Jurassic, we see something interesting going on, which is, I think, a reversal to lower level browsing and in some cases shorter necks. So, and this mainly seems to happen in the Diplodocus-like animals. So there's a whole group of things called the Diplodocoids or Diplodocoids. And within that, you've got your sort of Diplodocus family, your Diplodocids. They look like they were perhaps lower level browsers, and they sort of shorten their forelimbs a bit to kind of bring the whole shoulder, base of the neck area down closer to ground level. But another closely related family within that group are the dicraeosaurs, and they are weird animals. They get really quite short necks, almost at the same sort of proportions as you might see in some of the ornithischian competitors. And they really do look like they were constrained to be low-level browsers, just getting food from ground to maybe 2 meters above ground level, that sort of thing. And they're also weird in other ways. If you feel along your own backbone, you can feel little bumps of bone sticking out, right? Yeah, those are the neural spines, the tops of the vertebrae. And what dicraeosaurs do is basically elongate those, so they're like a foot long, 2 foot long, this kind of thing. So they have these weird spike-like neural spines sticking out in the neck and back region. And what that's for, we don't know. Display structure.
That's been my argument.
It's always your argument, Dave.
Well, it is, but it's hard to imagine they're anything else. So there was I don't know is it Barjasaurus? So the new one named from Argentina only a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
So Amargasaurus is the famous one, which I'm pretty sure we've talked about, where the spines kind of point up or backwards, and Barjasaurus has them going forward. And
I've seen drawings of that.
Yeah,
it's so weird.
It is weird. Yeah.
Right, and the authors completely ignored sexual selection, and then went, it's an anti-predator defense. And it's like, well, if they're anything like a Amargasaurus, they're not over the back and the tail.
Yeah.
And they're really, really flimsy. And if you're going to bite one of these things, the top of the neck, okay, you don't want to be bitten on the top of the neck by a big carnivore. but it's the bottom of the neck that has all the blood vessels and the trachea, and that's what'll kill you. So as a defence, they leave an awful lot to be desired.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, yeah, if you're growing a big, elaborate structure that doesn't have an obvious function, that's kind of where you'd probably go with it. But they've got odd necks as well, because, of course, you've got the Tanzanian, so we go back to Tanzania again, Dicraeosaurus itself, which has got weird cervical vertebrae, and they kind of stick up in the middle, but they're nothing like these giant, elaborate spines. So they're doing something odd.
And they're much shorter necks, so they go down to, say, 12 neck vertebrae, and they shorten each one, and they lose a lot of the air spaces. So, I mean, sauropods are really good at basically invading their bones with what we call the pneumatic system, so air sacs and so on, and that makes them light but strong. You know, you only remove the bone where you don't need it, and so you get these very light but strong structures. And they're stopping doing that for some reason, actually making their bones more solid. So there's a whole piece of work there, I think, to understand what's going on there. But they are shortening their necks. Those weird spines along the neck and back would make it difficult for them to raise their necks into a more vertical position, and they're shortening the forelimbs. So the whole thing looks like it's aiming towards lower level browsing, essentially, but they are weird. So that's the kind of Jurassic story. Once we get into the Cretaceous, a lot of your kind of standard Jurassic lineages of sauropod die out at some point between the Jurassic Cretaceous boundary 145 million years ago and, let's say, about 30 million years after that. There's sort of a transition, a turnover, as it were. And what we're left with is one fairly obscure group of Diplodocus or diplodocoid-like animals, the Reproductions. They themselves don't make it through to the end of the Cretaceous, but the real dominant group in the Cretaceous are the Titanosaurs and their close relatives. And that's where body size gets interesting, because they seem to, rather than there being a long-term trend towards even bigger body size, what they do is kind of fill body size ecospace more completely. So that's where we see our super gigantic things like Argentinosaurus that are 35 meters long and probably 60 or 70 tons. But we also see some dwarf things. In fact, we're doing some work on this thing called Magyarosaurus from Romania, which is right at the end, just a few million years before the final extinction. And we're talking about an animal there that, was sort of 2, 3, 4 meters long. So they really did have a whole range of different body sizes as they kind of, I think, sort of explored different aspects of what body size does for you in ecological terms.
How much of that might just be opportunism, though? Because my understanding, possibly incorrectly, is that, Magyarosaurus and things like Europasaurus, these really tiny ones, are island taxa and therefore kind of classic island dwarfism. And so is that Titanosaurs exploring other niche space because of something about Titanosaur evolution, or is it simply our island record of dinosaurs is absolutely pathetic, and I'm sure if you dropped diplodocids onto an island in the late Jurassic, they'd have formed dwarfs, we just haven't seen it?
That's a very good question, and I think if we only had things like Magyarosaurus, I'd agree with you, but we've also got Saltosaurus and Nequensaurus from Argentina that don't seem to be island dwarfs in that sense, but they're actually still quite small. We're talking about maybe 5 meters long, and that is small by sauropod standards, and it looks like it's a clade, a group, as it were, of closely related animals that were doing something rather different.
I didn't know they got that small. So this is one of those classic problems that you have of, you read papers and you don't necessarily check scale bars or really think about things, or you only encounter people just describing the animals. And I'd always thought of Saltosaurus as being not huge, but Diplodocus size, not quite the length, but the body size, and then with its own neck and tail on the end. Whereas, no, I've clearly got that 2 or 3 times the size that I thought it was.
Yeah.
So that's a huge discrepancy. And they're at 5 meters. I mean, they're getting on to inverted commas prosauropod size. That's tiny.
Or perhaps, of the same level as a lot of the ornithischian herbivores that they might have been competing with or interacting with in some ways.
Yeah, definitely. I'm thinking in terms of body size, that's little more than a rhino, because this is the problem with scaling when you're talking to obviously people is we say, 5 meters long, that sounds absolutely enormous. But when 1.5 meters plus of that is tail and 1.5 meters of that is neck, you're actually not talking about a particularly big animal. If you talk about a big body that's 1.5 meters long, that's a cow, or not much more than that. These are tiny animals in the grand scheme of things.
No, you're absolutely right. I actually saw Saltosaurus and Nequensaurus in Argentina. There's a Nequensaurus skeleton, I think, at the La Plata Museum, and there's a Saltosaurus in, I think, Tucumán. And you take away the neck and tail, what you've got basically is something very similar to the size of as you say, a cow, something like that.
What I don't particularly understand is presumably these things start tiddly tiny because they've got to fit into an egg. What are the pressures which would say, let's stop at the size of a cow or let's go on to the size of a bus?
Yeah, I mean, we still don't fully understand the answer to that. I mean, Dave's point about island dwarfism. So when you get stuck in an environment where there are limited resources, quite often the answer is to say, well, I'm just not going to grow as big, right? But there are cases like the Saltosaurs in Argentina where that it's difficult to explain in those terms. But, you know, even if we take that away, we've still got a big range of different body sizes among sauropods. And I think that what's going on is probably a mixture of things. There will be some aspects of environmental conditions. So you've got to build this body and you've got to maintain the body with the resources in your environment. And so if things like climate changes or, and particularly plant fodder resources change, the nature of those plants or the energy content of those plants, then it could have an impact on your body size. There are general pressures in evolution, not just for sauropods, but generally we see over and over again the possibility that things tend to grow larger. Now, other things can intervene, particularly mass extinctions tend to reset things a bit. But essentially, for a sauropod perspective, the bigger you are, for example, the greater your defense against predation. So there are good reasons for sauropods going from that egg stage to something approaching adult size as quickly as possible. And there is some histological evidence that suggests that growth rates among juvenile sauropods were actually very high in order to fuel this rapid growth. So you want to be big, but of course, if the resources aren't there, then that might not be possible. But on top of that, I think there's also some issues of interactions with your competitors to some extent. So there are a lot of sauropods around in some of these environments. If you go to the Morrison Formation in the late Jurassic of North America, there are, I've lost track now, but it's probably like 24 species of sauropod. Now, yes, they are potentially spread across a chunk of time that's as much as, 10 million years, but no less, we find quarries with several different types of sauropod in them. So they were clearly living side by side or meeting each other. And so obviously you can have different mouth parts, different neck lengths. You can attempt to tackle different plants, or you could tackle different parts of the same plant, but body size is going to be in the mix there in terms of you carving out your own niche relative to what other sauropods are doing.
Presumably that niche changes as you grow.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. We don't know much about that, but I think you're absolutely right. If as an adult, your prime fodder grows on trees at a height of, say, 10 meters above ground level, then clearly as a juvenile, you're not going to be able to reach that. So you would be doing something different. So, I mean, we would love to know more about that, but the fossil record of juvenile sauropods is really sparse. So it's difficult to get a handle on that. We do, however, have some nice trackway evidence to suggest that the juveniles tended to live in age-related cohorts in herds. You could certainly get mixed herds of sauropods, and there is some evidence of sort of, big adults on the outside and younger ones in the middle being protected. But we also find these kind of track sites where everything appears to be basically a juvenile sauropod, and they were perhaps, when they hatch out, wouldn't have got a lot of parental care, so they would sort of band together to form protective herd in that sense.
We've discussed a little bit about sauropod reproduction and how many eggs they laid. Was that across all species, or is it a case that we've only got evidence for a few sort of laying fields?
So the vast majority of sauropods, we don't have any evidence of what eggs they laid or whether they laid eggs or how many eggs. It's really only until we get to the titanosaurs in the late Cretaceous that we find a good fossil record of eggs. Now, and that itself is a bit of a mystery. In terms of sort of what other earlier sauropods were doing, we can infer that they were egg layers. Some of the prosauropods, or their sort of ancestral stock back in the Jurassic were egg layers. Everything around sauropods in sort of evolutionary tree terms, phylogenetic terms, is an egg layer, right? Birds descended from theropods, they laid eggs. We know theropods had eggs, ornithischians had eggs, crocodiles have eggs. It'd be really weird if sauropods were the one group that had live birth like mammals or something. But as I say, most, virtually all of your Jurassic and early Cretaceous sauropods just don't see any eggs. So we wonder if there's some kind of sampling thing going on. And one possibility is that this has something to do with oxygen levels in the atmosphere. So when you're an embryo in an egg, you're in this enclosed environment. You've got your food supply, your water supply. You're protected by shell and membranes and so on. But you've got to have gas exchange. So So your carbon dioxide has to leave and oxygen has to get in, but at the same time you've got a hard shell to protect you from, anything from bacteria and insects through to, some of the predators that are out there. So gas exchange has to happen across the eggshell and eggshell membranes. And obviously, if atmospheric oxygen levels were lower in the Jurassic and early Cretaceous, then you would have to have a thinner shell to make that feasible. And the thinner shell means more delicate and therefore less likely to survive. So it has been proposed that these things were laying eggs, but they're just not surviving because they were too delicate. But then we see an uptick in atmospheric oxygen towards the end of the Cretaceous. And so that would mean that potentially titanosaurs could have evolved thicker shelled eggs, because obviously that gives you greater protection. And because there was more oxygen around, that wouldn't have adversely affected the diffusion rates of gas exchange. So it's an interesting idea. I'm not entirely sure I'm convinced by it, but it has been proposed, and I think it's kind of intriguing.
What about the possibility that the eggs are just relatively soft? Because there was Mark Norell's paper from, only a couple of years ago with Protoceratops eggs, which are apparently, not soft, but, turtle or crocodile level of soft, which I think before that we simply didn't think was possible in dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Because you're right, there's that big absence of sauropods. So it's not the only thing. Like tyrannosaurs are really common, and we've got no tyrannosaur eggs. So it's the possibility that a whole bunch of taxa are doing that. But might that be another alternate? Is they're laying relatively soft-shelled eggs?
It's not my area. What I'd want to be interested to know is what are the pros and cons of soft-shelled versus hard-shelled eggs? We do see this variation across living groups as much as anything else. So is it a different explanation, or is it part of the same explanation in terms of gas exchange and other aspects? So certainly it's a possibility, but again we'd have to ask the question, why did titanosaurs switch to harder, thicker shelled eggs in the late Cretaceous, and does that have anything to do with either oxygen levels or something about how they were producing their nests, how they were incubating them, things like that?
That's where at least something like Protoceratops is quite interesting, because of course it's coming from formations where we've got huge numbers of hard theropod eggs, and okay, they might have been doing things subtly differently, but it's hard to immediately imagine that, it's because of the time period, or it's because they're both in a desert and therefore it's a water phenomenon. Well, not if they're doing totally different things side by side. It's definitely a complicated one. But it hadn't occurred to me until you said it. Sauropod eggs from the Jurassic basically don't exist.
Here's a silly idea for you, Dave. So
good. I like them.
So think about it. The theropods, they don't have to necessarily be in a hurry to get out of the egg, right? Because they're the predators. Maybe if you're vulnerable herbivore, you want to get out of that egg as quickly as possible, because once that struggling motion starts to happen, you attract the attention of a predator, and you've got this hard-shelled egg holding you back. It's probably nonsense, but it's an interesting idea, right? That there may be some other factors there. And I guess the other thing is about think about more seriously. Think about it'd be interesting to look at things like clutch size and the resources that go into those eggs, because the mother has to contribute her resources to build those shells, right? And we know in some harsh environments that actually finding the calcium and phosphate, whatever you need to put the whole package together, can be difficult. So it might be that there's some compromises there, and you feel, well, I'm going to have a few more eggs, but I'm not going to be able to protect each one so much. So I think it's quite a complex set of things going on there.
Could it also be that the mothers might be eating the eggshells afterwards, just to recoup some of that calcium?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm guessing some living animals do that. I don't actually know. So if you know about that, then you know more than I do.
I know that you feed eggshells to chickens, but that's usually part of their meal.
There is the calcium issue, but the difference with chickens is that they're laying eggs basically constantly because we bred them to, rather than having the whole year to save up. But going back to Paul's point, there's basically the parental care angle, and if you're a theropod, you're generally laying fewer, larger eggs, and then you're looking after the nest in a way that sauropods probably aren't, or at least most of them probably aren't. And therefore, if you're a kind of just dump the eggs and run off, anything which improves survival incrementally, if you're laying maybe 50 eggs at a time to survive that first couple of weeks rather than one, well, that's a massive, massive difference in terms of survivability. I wouldn't necessarily it's what driving it, but certainly I can imagine the synchronized hatching phenomenon and flooding the landscape and getting out, as you say, getting out as soon as possible could well be part of the driver.
This sounds silly, but could it also be that if you're laying an eggs and you're a sauropod, those eggs have to drop a long way, And so if they're slightly bouncy, that would make sense if they could absorb the impact of the fall. Because even if that sauropod goes into a low squat, that's still several metres above the ground.
Well, for most of them, so typically hip height in unless we're talking about the supergiants, hip height in a typical sauropod would be between 2 and 3 metres above ground level. So the reproductive vents would have been a little lower than that. So let's take off half a metre. And then I think you could probably get another half metre, maybe a full metre with a kind of, squatting, bending at the knee type action. But that still, I think, leaves a good metre of drop.
And if they've dug a hole, it's then falling into the hole.
Exactly, yeah. I guess it depends what they're doing in terms of nesting strategy. So while digging a hole does increase the depth of drop, it also allows you to disrupt what might otherwise have been quite a hard surface. And so a lot of powdered, mashed up soil, sand, whatever, might have provided a softer landing. But yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone's done any kind of, sort of biomechanical, we could do like finite elements analysis type stuff of modeling eggs dropping from height and seeing, do they bounce or do they smash? But
there's also that classic kind of good enough problem. Let's say they're laying 70, 80 eggs at a time, which I don't think is impossible. If they lose the first 3 or 4 eggs from the rest of them hitting them, that may not be a big deal if they're looking at 95% mortality in the first couple of months anyway. Sacrificing a couple of eggs to make sure the rest get through. Yeah, it's one of those classic problems that gets really, really messy very fast indeed, with all the different possibilities and tiered levels of selection.
Well, the evidence we have at the moment suggests that what sauropods were doing was producing a very large number of eggs, but not putting too many of them in any one clutch. So the model we envisage is perhaps a female producing a couple of hundred eggs and then putting them in clutches of, pick a number like 20 or something, and then distributing these clutches around. So it's literally not having all your eggs in one basket, which I very much like. And it makes sense as a way of fooling your predators and increasing your chances. But essentially it's what we call an R selection strategy, where you produce a lot of young, don't give them too much in the way of parental protection or investment, and then hope that just a few survive into the next generation. But actually this strategy might hold the key to the long-term survivability of sauropods, because people have talked about sauropods basically go through a number of environmental crises and mass extinctions at the Triassic boundary, and possibly something going on at the Jurassic Cretaceous boundary and so on. And if you're able to produce a very large number of eggs, or young essentially, fairly quickly, then it gives you an opportunity to rebuild your population quite quickly. And this kind of explains a slight anomaly, which is we know that the very largest animals are more vulnerable to extinction because they normally, large body size, would be associated with slower reproduction rates and greater vulnerability to environmental perturbation. And yet the sauropods seem to be okay until, at least until the asteroid hits. And so this ability to produce lots of young really quickly might hold the key to explain why such large animals were able to cope with the kind of general vicissitudes of minor to medium level extinction events during the 150 million years of evolution.
Yeah, and probably that kind of general dinosaur thing of sort of hitting reproductive age at about half adult size meant that, compared to something like an elephant or a whale, you're not hanging around for 30, 40 years before you hit decent reproductive age. You can hit that at 10, 15 and being relatively small. So, in terms of limited resource environments and all the rest of it, that would probably help as well. And again, they can dump maybe a dozen eggs if they're having a really bad year, whereas an elephant, you either give birth to something that weighs 500 kilos or not at all, and that's a fairly binary position to be trapped in. On the subject of sauropods, because I do want to move on to a couple of other things before the end, and we're doing really quite well. So the question that I've definitely been asked a fair bit, and I have no good answer. I have a couple of ideas, and they're kind of terrible. Why are sauropod skulls so phenomenally rare? Because by my... You'll have a better count than I do, but by my count, we've got like maybe 25, 30 good sauropod skulls worldwide. And, okay, yes, the limbs are really robust, they're going to survive. The vertebrae are pretty fragmentary, they won't do so well. But even at, a place like Tendaguru in Tanzania, which we kind of mentioned in passing, where there's huge numbers of skeletons and huge number of very well-preserved vertebrae, we've pulled out like 2 half-decent skulls. Sauropod skulls basically don't exist, so why?
We're discovering, probably discovering and naming 10, 12 new sauropods per year. So things are improving, and I think there are, it depends what you mean by a decent skull, but there are an awful lot of brain cases out there because that's the more robust part of the skull. I'll give you my joke answer first, if I may, and then I'll give you a serious answer. So when I was a PhD student, I noticed this phenomenon, and I made up this scenario whereby sauropods potentially had stomach stones, although that it itself is now quite controversial. But back in the 1990s, this was thought to be the case. And I came up with this idea that sauropods, the long neck was actually to act as a kind of like a rifle barrel, and that they could regurgitate these stones at speed to fire them at predators. Right?
This is amazing.
I can't believe I haven't heard this before.
This is great.
And this is the best bit. But being quite stupid, they would sometimes forget to open their mouths and blow their own heads off. So that's my joke answer, which I'm determined to get published.
I mean, we both know there are less plausible things actually in the scientific literature. So
the serious answer, I think, is that it's because it's at an extremity of a very large animal. And what we find actually is not only are skulls rare, but the tips of the tail are rare, and hands and feet are quite rare. And myself and Phil Mannion and a few other people have done some work looking at kind of quantifying the completeness of skeletons. We've done this for sauropods, but we've done it for Cretaceous birds and a bunch of other things as well. And sauropods are interesting, particularly if you then compare them with birds, which of course are a very different type of organism. What we've found with the sauropods is that being so large and with so many robust bones, they actually have a better chance of being preserved than your very delicate birds and so on. But when you find a bird, it tends to be more complete than a sauropod. And I think what's going on there is, either the bird is totally smashed and lost, or you get some special preservational environment and you get all or most of it. The sauropod, what kind of sedimentary event is needed to completely bury a 35-meter long skeleton, right? Of course, there are going to be bits sticking out. It's going to rot. Bits are going to float away. So I think that's the answer. It's just unfortunate. The sauropod skull is at the end of something very long and is less likely to get covered. And it's not the most robust part of the skeleton either. So if you're looking at the kind of the sacrum hip area and the big thigh bones and so on, I mean, a thigh bone can be like 2 meters long. After fossilization, can weigh a metric ton. These are not easily shifted around, and they're pretty robust to being battered. Whereas a skull doesn't take long to smash that up, and it's difficult to bury the whole thing. So that's why actually when we do find skulls, we either find skulls by themselves, or it's just a skull and neck, this kind of thing. So I think that explanation kind of makes sense of what's going on there.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I'd say, tail tips and feet are missing for lots of things, and that extremity problem is definitely true. But I'd say skulls are rather more...
And not for Spinosaurs.
Well, yeah.
So that's all we get is the tips.
All we get is snouts. But I think probably that in a combination with, as you say, the fact that in general their skulls are very, very spindly. And actually, I hadn't realised how many brain cases there are, and that kind of points to the fact that it's because if it's just the extremity thing, the brain case should go too. And if it's not, then I think the general spindliness of sauropod skulls is at least part of the problem, or at least a fairly major part of the problem.
Brain cases are the most common element, and then lower jaws, particularly the robust front end, are probably next. And I actually went to Brigham Young University to look at some stuff they had there about 10 years ago, and they had literally pulled about 15 brain cases out of this quarry and had them all lined up on the desk.
Wow.
It's a very interesting experience to kind of see so much anatomical data available when normally there'd be nothing. But it was only brain cases. Brain cases have a few teeth, a little bit of lower jaw, very little in the way of the main sort of snout area.
So the last thing I wanted to get onto, if we may, is your vision problem. I don't know how to put it politely, to be quite honest.
You can say visual impairment is
visual impairment, fine. Yeah. So obviously this is a podcast, but I believe you're registered legally blind in the UK?
That's right, yes.
This is something I really wanted to talk about. And as you may remember, I did a kids book a while ago. But I asked to include you on this because I was trying to do some stuff on representation. And obviously there's that issue of, disability in sciences, and it's something I get a lot of questions about. And I think yours is certainly, it may be unique with invertebrate paleontology at least, but I would have thought yours is the kind of impairment that people would think would, almost preclude a career in paleontology. Yeah. And as we say, at the start, we're talking to not just a professor, but the head of department at a major university. I wouldn't even know quite what to ask about it, so I'll just pass the floor back to you and let you say what you want to.
There is another paleontologist with a visual impairment, a guy called Vermeij, who's very eminent professor out in California, but he studies, I think, gastropods. So I'm struggling to think of, I don't know anyone else actually in vertebrate paleontology with a visual impairment. And it is such a visual field that, I mean, I was told as a child that, this is very unlikely to happen and that I should become an economist or something. But I've always been quite stubborn on that. And actually hearing about Vermeij when I was an undergraduate did give me, that boost you get, I think, from seeing a role model and thinking, well, if that person can do it, then why can't I? I mean, I'm not going to lie, it has been a struggle. It's not easy doing this. I've been fortunate, I think, that technology has really, improved and helps a lot. My computer will read files to me, will read scientific papers to me aloud. I can dictate emails and bits of papers. I can edit my own papers in Word using the accessibility software and things like that. But there's still, we're supposed to illustrate our papers, right? And that is a struggle. I mean, I have blown things up very large in Photoshop and sort of almost pixel by pixel done editing. But to be honest, as I've got more senior, I'm kind of relying more on high quality collaborations to fill in some of those gaps. Of course, the other issue is it's a very field based subject, and I did actually have an experience of digging up some sauropod tracks in Dorset about 25 years ago. But it's something that I haven't really gone into because I just think that the field environment would be very tricky, and I'm not sure how useful I would be because when a bone is still largely in the rock, it's difficult for me to extract much information from it. And so I tend to start by going to museums and collecting data there, and then I suppose it's always also kind of focus my attention on some of the bigger level questions. Because you can fuel a paleontological career, particularly in dinosaurs, by digging up new stuff and then sending your papers to Science and Nature, and that's incredibly valuable. The subject needs an influx of new data, but it's something that I would personally struggle with. So I've tend to think about, are our methods the best we can make them? What can we do to improve data sets? What are the big questions we should be asking and trying to tackle? So I guess that's how I've tried to carve out a niche in that sense. But I would say that my problem is that I'm not bad at coming up with good ideas, but I'm quite slow to actually implement any of them and get something out of them. But obviously I've managed to survive, and that's great. We're seeing a lot more attention on diversity and equality and inclusion these days, and that's really healthy and good to see.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'd also say that, the idea that you're not going into the field or not, sitting on those kinds of things or even museum specimens is also not exactly inspiring, but it certainly helps bust the myth, because certainly again, a question I get was, how often do you get into the field? And in my case, very rarely, a few days at a time here and there every couple of years. And I think people think that, I finished my last lecture in May, mark the exam scripts, and I'm off to Heathrow and I'll see you again in October. And, every single documentary implies that that's what paleontologists do. And of course, it really is quite rare. But also, to touch on it, because I've seen you do this when I was based in China, and you came out with Paul Barrett in probably something like 2011, 2012, about 10 years ago. Yeah, and we were out at their kind of outstation, and you were looking over some of the sauropod material, and you were basically doing it by touch and dictating. Yeah. And
that's crazy, by the way.
Yeah, and I found that phenomenal, because as someone who I think of myself as being quite a visual person, and I think I've got a good mind's eye for what things are, and I do a lot of stuff by that kind of memory. And yet, Paul gave you this bone, and you were like, oh yeah, there's a spinodiapophyseal lamina, and it's really quite expanded. And that's interesting, because the one we looked at yesterday was about half that size, and it's bigger than the one I saw in Neuquén, and it's slightly smaller than the one in Tanzania that's in Berlin that we saw 2 years ago. And I'm like, I struggle to do that when I've got photos in front of me, and you're doing it by touch and memory. And so, not only is it absolutely phenomenal to observe, but again, your impairment does not preclude doing classic paleontological things like field work or specimen work or describing new taxa.
Well, what's interesting, I think, is I think anyone potentially in my position would adapt. I mean, if you want to do something badly enough and with enough practice, you can do this. I mean, I'll say two things relevant to this. One is, occasionally it has actually been an advantage in the sense that Sauropods are very big, which obviously makes them easier to study in tactile terms. But, when they're mounted in museums, sometimes, some of the trunk vertebrae are like 3 meters above ground level, and they're difficult to see. Even with a ladder, they're difficult to see. And some bits are hidden. And sometimes things are mounted up against walls, so you can't see the side facing the wall. So it's Muggins here that gets sent up by his collaborators to have a feel around in these inaccessible areas and bring back some data. So in that sense, I kind of feel I've made a contribution. The other thing is, you mentioned sort of, classical paleontology. What I find interesting, and I guess hopeful for me personally, is that there's a whole swathe of information that until fairly recently was inaccessible. We know that, CT scanned data of, really fiddly little things in brain cases, like, the stapes and the semicircular canals and all these little bits and pieces. Those are incredibly difficult for me to study, right? And so for about 20 years of CT scan data dominated paleontology, I kind of felt left out and a bit concerned that there's a chunk there that I can't get to. However, now the combination of CT scan data and 3D printing means that I can essentially print those things out at a size that suits me and have an opportunity to study them. So I think that opens up some nice possibilities. And it can kind of work in the other way as well, in that, obviously some bits of sauropods are really big, and it's quite nice to be able to print them out at smaller size and make them more manageable. So, there's no substitute for actually looking at the real thing, but, a high quality scan and print is something that you can get a lot of data out of. So it does open up new opportunities for me.
I'd absolutely agree. And winding up, so on the subject of museum specimens and accessibility of collections, so I only actually went to Cambridge for the first time about two or 3 years ago. I never made it up there, was pottering around the museum, and in one of the beautiful old wooden cases there was a whole shelf of like random teeth from, I think, Cambridge green sand or Oxford clay or something like that. And at the end there was a gap, and there was a little notice, and it said, "Crocodile tooth borrowed by Paul Upchurch. It's in his office." And then dated, I think, 97. Oh, wow. So you might want to give that back.
Right, well, thanks for embarrassing me, Dave. I've got no idea what that specimen is. I'll have to look now. But it's quite possible, if we're talking about 25 years ago, that they've got me and Paul Barrett confused, so we might need to double check that. So it happened a lot back then. That's perfectly
possible. But it was more that I was thinking of course, we all know of PhD students and postdocs who, drop out of the field and just vanish. And I can imagine that someone pottering around the museum going, "Oh, John Smith, oh God, I haven't heard that name. We're never going to find him again. But you're the bloody head of Earth Sciences at UCL. It shouldn't be too hard to track you down."
Yeah, I actually have no memory of that whatsoever, so it could be
but as you say, I know for a while, because you and Paul were contemporaries and you were kind of the two Pauls. And so, it's perfectly possible someone's written Upchurch when they meant Barrett. So let's just blame it on him because he's not here.
He'll be furious.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I don't know if you are on Twitter or anything like that, or write a blog or that sort of thing, but now is your time to plug it if you do.
I am not really on social media at all. I'm very archaic in that sense. But actually, one of the compromises I have to make as someone with a visual impairment is being really tight on time management. Yeah. And social media, I think it's great for outreach and things like that, but it can be a huge time sink, especially if you get into some kind of Twitter battle with a dino nerd about something. So, and I like to have the last word on things, so it's probably dangerous territory.
Literally yesterday I was getting Spinosaurus comments, and it's like, and I shouldn't have engaged, I should have walked away, and yet...
Yeah.
It was my fault I atted him.
Yeah.
So...
I blame her. But on that subject, I know that time is tight for you, and so we doubly appreciate you coming on and doing this today.
It was really great.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I've enjoyed it.
A massive thank you to Paul Upchurch there. I think it's really cool that he has such a prestigious career, considering that he has very little eyesight. I think it's absolutely incredible, and
it genuinely is. I mean, 2 or 3 years ago, I did an outreach event. I think it would have been just before COVID, and I think it was one I did at the for the Royal Vet College, actually. Someone came in and wanted to see the dinosaurs, were very excited, and I'd say they were 12 or 13, and said, they're with their parents or the mother, I think, but said, the problem is he's got really seriously impaired eyesight. Is it an impediment? Will they ever get a career? And the answer was, obviously, it's a bit of a challenge, but here's proof that it can be done. And not just be done, as you say. It's the prestigiousness. It's not just, well, he managed to scrape through a degree and he managed to get a PhD in the end and then has got a couple of papers out. No, he got his degree and his PhD from Cambridge, and as you say, is now a professor and head of department, and with an incredible track record of research behind him. And so, yeah, it absolutely can be done. So, yeah, here is someone who has a more severe visual impediment than you do and has succeeded in a way that I haven't, and many, many, many other paleontologists never will. You can do it. And so having that, as that phrase, you can't be what you can't see, you can see that attainment right there. It can be done. And so, yeah, Paul may shy away from this, but in that regard, he is a flag bearer for what can be achieved, and as a result is enormously important.
So I hope that you've taken some inspiration and as well learnt a lot about long necky sauropods. I can't call them necky necks because I think Dave might hit me through the internet.
just hit the leave button on the call. Though I notice you've achieved in calling them necky necks by saying that you're not going to.
I'm not going to call them necky necks. I'm not immature like that because, we can't have bitey bites, flappy flaps and necky necks all in one series. Stop swearing at me. Right, until next week, we will say rawr. 1, 2, 3. Rawr. Thank you for downloading this episode of Terrible Lizards. For extra content, become a patron on patreon.com/Terrible Lizards. Dave's book, The Future of Dinosaurs, or How Fast Did T-Rex Run, is available to buy now. Do check out Izzy Lawrence's other podcasts and books by visiting iszi.com. Please send questions, suggestions, and other feedback to terriblelizardspod@gmail.com. And catch up with old live episodes on youtube.com/ISZITube. Do leave us a review, it does make a difference, and find us on social media and say hello with the hashtag Terrible Lizards. Thanks again to our patrons. Without your support, we wouldn't be making this series.